Good evening and welcome to the Way Out Show. I'm your host, Dane McCarthy, broadcasting to you from FEMA Region 5, deep in the bowels of the United Police State of America. Today is July 1, 2015, and as usual, there's a lot of news, a lot of things going on, and we'll try to cover just a few of those events that are shaping our world, shaping our attitudes, shaping our future. Because it's really because we have no future. I mean, unless we can really think about the future, plan for the future. I may be accused of planning a little bit too much, but I think it's necessary in these times because the amount of change that is coming down the pike toward us is absolutely an avalanche, and it looks like there's no stopping it. And I'm not talking about an avalanche of snow as a result of global cooling or global warming or climate change or whatever it is they're calling it at the latest moment. We have to take into account that change is the one single constant in the evolving universe, and we have to really look at the motives for those who would blame that change on human beings. Because the implication is with climate change that if it weren't for human beings, the climate would not be changing. And as everyone knows who took middle school science or high school science, the planet is always changing, always evolving. The flora and the fauna, the mountains rise and fall, the rivers change their course, sea levels rise and fall. This has always been going on. So now we are told that all of the change is due to human activity. And it's very difficult for many people to believe this because, number one, it's something that's never happened before in human history, according to these climate scientists, climatologists. Never before have humans had this much ability to change the climate. And we have to think about this. It's due to technology, they say, and number one, too many people. So you have to wonder about their agenda. Is their long-term agenda to solve the problem of too many people? And you have to ultimately say, very possibly, very possibly. There is a lot of evidence to show that this is the plan down the road, and there are various means to get that plan into operation. Now, one of them is with the GMO food. Now, GMO, genetically modified organisms, are being introduced into our food supply on a greater and greater basis, larger and larger, more and more foodstuffs. They have just created a GMO apple that will supposedly have a longer shelf life. You can cut it and it won't turn brown in exposure to air. You know, who cares about that? Well, people who want to have their food not turn brown, and that would be commercial people, restaurants and so on. So this is the idea behind that. But it's not really that important or necessary. There are other ways to keep apples from turning brown upon exposure to air without actually genetically modifying them and creating an entirely new apple that never existed in nature. And remember, these things aren't just temporary. They enter the food system, those seeds of those apples will be there, and there is always the danger that they will, at some point down the road, get into the general apple supply and pollute it with the toxic GMO changes that have been placed on the genetic level. This is genetics we're talking about. And it's not just the classic genetics that has been used for centuries to create hybrids and new flowers and new animals and new plants. No, this is entirely different. This is high-tech. This is something called a gene gun, which is shot directly into the gene. So you can actually cross species. You can put animal genes into a plant gene and vice versa, and they have been doing this on all levels. You can go to certain markets in Asia and get, like for instance, glow-in-the-dark monkeys. Now, how do they accomplish that? Because they take the gene from the deep-sea fish or the deep-sea plant and genetically shoot that into the gene of the monkey, and voila, you have a glow-in-the-dark monkey. And this is supposed to be all fun, and it's a selling point. So the GMO organisms introduced into the food supply, you would think that a company like Monsanto and Merck and these other chemical companies that are doing this creation of GMOs might be concerned, might be worried, because there is a danger. We're already seeing a danger. So how have they mitigated that danger for themselves? They've created a seed vault, and this is a number of years ago now, in an island off the coast of Norway called Spitsbergen, and Monsanto is involved in this, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and other of the big movers and shakers of those who are interested in reducing the number of people on the planet. So what could be their plan? Well, first, let's watch a clip from, I believe, CNN, about 4 minutes long, which actually sort of introduced this seed vault to the public.
Noah's Ark, of sorts, for plant life, opens in the Arctic Circle today. The facility, dubbed the Doomsday Vault, will house samples of the world's most important seeds as an insurance policy for mankind. Let's go live now to the Norwegian town of Longyearbyen, just north of the Arctic Circle, where our very own Becky Anderson is at the inauguration of the vault. Did I get the name right, Becky?
Longyearbyen, nearly. You're absolutely right. We are here in the Arctic, just a couple of degrees short, in fact, of the North Pole, which is that's where, and we're here for a very special reason, as you suggested, Adrian. We're here for the inauguration of what has become known as the Doomsday Vault. Now, that sits behind it. It's also being called a very modern-day Noah's Ark. And let me tell you why. Inside the vault behind me is a very, very, very long tunnel going straight into that Arctic mountain. At the end of that tunnel are a series of vaults, and inside those vaults, in the weeks and months to come, will be a series of aluminium envelopes like these. Eventually, inside these envelopes are about 500 seed samples, and eventually there'll be about 2.25 billion seeds inside this mountain. Now, the idea being that if global catastrophe strikes, the world's crops, at least, will be deep frozen inside that mountain. It's a project which has been funded by the Norwegian government to the tune of about $9 million. And there's a very important reason for this. We are facing, they tell us, a very perfect storm. 9 billion people on the planet by the year 2050. We've got the idea of global warming and climate change, which may affect us going forward, and there's no more land, which means the agricultural industry going forward is extremely unsustainable. The idea of this is that we will have the world's crops, at least samples of the world's crops there, in case of any sort of disaster. And it's important, particularly for the developing world, as Wangari Maathai, the Nobel Prize winner, told me a little earlier on.
I think that it's a great vision, it's a great dream. For many nations, it is something that they need now, because there are very many nations in the world who are losing their seeds as we speak. And it would be great to know that their seeds are stored somewhere, they are safe, and tomorrow if they need them, they are accessible.
And let me just put this into context for you, Adrian, before I go, because it's about minus 35 out here with a wind chill. Consider this, there were something like 7,000 varieties of apple, for example, just some years ago. 6,800 of those are now extinct. It's that sort of number that we're facing, and I'm told that we lose a variety of crop every other day. This is important. This is where our agricultural heritage will be stored going forward, and the seeds in this vault will be stored for something like 19,500 years. So if doomsday does arrive, as some people suggest it will, as long as there's one person left, they'll be able to get into this vault, dig out the seeds and replant them. I'm off. It's absolutely freezing, Adrian.
We'll let you go in a moment. It wasn't until you spoke that I could tell it was you under that clothing. Briefly, I want to know, why does it have to be in such a hell-forsaken place, so remote and such a cold place? If there is a catastrophe, how can human beings get there?
Well, that's a very good point, but the idea of this is that these seeds need to be frozen inside an extremely secure environment, and the Norwegian government decided that this would be as good a place as any. You make a very good point. If there is a disaster, who's going to be able to get up here? But I guess if there's a disaster, people are going to find it difficult to get anywhere. The point of this place is that you can keep these seeds frozen at the temperature that they need to be frozen, which is minus 20, in order for them not to deteriorate for thousands of years to come. So you make a very good point, but this is as good a place, the Norwegians and the international community tell me, as any. Adrian?
Becky, go and get warm. I'm cold just looking at you. Many thanks indeed. Becky Anderson, live in Norway.
Okay, what an incredible clip that is from CNN. It is absolutely mind-blowing. Now, they didn't mention Monsanto and the Bill Gates Foundation. She said that Norway is paying for this. I don't think that's accurate. Now, the way that Monsanto and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and other foundations may have done this is they may have given the money to Norway, and then Norway did it, or something like that. They're pretty sneaky about doing this. But here you have a situation in which it is admitted that the seed varieties are vanishing, going extinct, and why would you suppose that is happening? Is that happening just by itself? No, it's happening because of the GMO that is being introduced into the commercial growers, and they're no longer planting the varieties, and they're going with the monoculture, which they're being told is going to be a better yield for their bottom line and their investors. And this oftentimes is not the case. The yield turns out to be much lower than they thought. And you know, it's really tragic that they're doing this, but because the seeds that have been developed, again, have not necessarily just developed by themselves. They've developed because humans have been developing different varieties of, they used the apples for hundreds, if not thousands of years of not only apples, but other types of fruits, and just, you know, selecting the best ones, and, you know, oh, they like this particular type of apple, so they start cultivating it and using, in a very natural way, the natural selective process of evolution to create new varieties. That's why there's so many different varieties of dogs, for instance, just to give you an example. But here we have many. She mentioned thousands of varieties of apples. I did not know there were that many, but I know that, for instance, with rice, there are many, many, many varieties of rice. Lots of people in the world eat rice, and that is the varieties of rice are a human effort is created this, a lot of this, but going to monoculture can be disastrous. And a good example of that, for instance, is the infamous potato famine in Ireland, which happened in the late 1840s and into the early 50s, about 5 years at least that it went on. Something like 1 million people died of starvation in Ireland as a result of a fungus which destroyed the potato crop entirely. It just destroyed everything because you had a monoculture. If you have a variety of different types of plant, fruit, then some of them may be stronger or just shrug off the disease and not be affected by whatever the pest is or the disease. And so your chances of not starving to get death are much greater. But because of commercial pressure to go with one variety and to the exclusion of all others, not only are you risking the extinction of the seeds of the non-used varieties, but you're also risking the health of the and mass starvation. So what we could be looking at here for the future on planet Earth is mass starvation, not in one small country like Ireland, or we've seen other starvation situations, of course, around the world. This has happened many times. And usually it's not just the weather, the lack of rain or so on, or maybe too much rain, wipes out the crop, flood or something. These things happen. But it's oftentimes the incompetence or downright deliberate sabotage of the crop by the government itself. The rulers of the country, for whatever reason, want to cull the population. They want to get, let's say, a certain tribe of people out of that area. What do? They make it impossible for them to grow food. War is a major instigator of starvation, and a lot of times that is part of the oppression against the target population that they want removed from a particular area. Now, sometimes governments actually go as far as to instigate or create genocide situations, encouraging the people to kill the demonized group, the small group or something that is in the way of the larger group, the vulnerable group, and they are destroyed. So there's many different ways that populations can be decimated, not only by starvation. These governments are extremely creative in coming up with ways to murder their own citizens. And this is historically just part of the historical record. So what we have here is a very sinister plan by the globalist powers that it's not just Norway. It's not Norway's idea. I mean, the reason why it's so remote is so that most people can't get to it. You heard the young woman the commentator who was talking about this, saying this with the windshield, it was 35 below there, and she looked very, very cold. It's up by the Arctic Circle, and this is a high-tech facility. It's guarded, so not just anyone can get into that. It's clear that the winners, those who consider themselves to be the winners of the future, in other words, the survivors, to create the new world in which a whole new human race, the old human race, will be wiped clean from the planet, and the winners, the small group of winners who are at this moment, many of them, some of the richest and most powerful people on the planet, will leave their bunkers, will get in their helicopter and fly off their private island, their mountaintop retreat, their remote compound and palace in the jungles of Uruguay or Africa, and they will take over the world. This would be after the incredible catastrophe that they, by creating GMO foods themselves, are clearly planning for. I mean, this cannot be just a coincidence. They expect there to be an enormous disaster. Now, the commentator mentioned 2050, saying there was 9 billion people expected to be living on planet Earth by 2050, the middle of the 21st century, only 35 years from now. Now, that seed vault has been in operation for, I don't know, at least 10 years. So they were looking at 40, almost 50 years of waiting. Now, it could be that they plan this in their long-term planning scheme. Many of them will not be alive, but they are looking forward to living a long time using technology, and they also think in terms of legacy for their family. These are families, for the most part. Bill and Melinda Gates will pass on their fortune to their children will pass it on to their children, just like the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers and the other of the elite families on the planet. I'm sure the Clintons would love to join that, or maybe they already considered themselves to have joined that small group. The Bushes certainly are part of that group with their criminal behavior stretching all the way back at least to George W.'s grandfather, Prescott Bush, who actually was involved in a plot to try to overthrow the United States government when FDR was president, and he was too rich, too powerful to be touched by the law, and the plot was revealed to the to the Congress by a patriotic citizen who actually, Smedley Butler, who actually had been asked to head up the new fascist state that would be created after FDR was overthrown. He didn't go along with it, though. He was too much of a patriot, and he exposed the whole plot. So America was allowed to continue on with the Republic, at least for a while. Now the plan seems to be to use the stealth tactics to remove the freedoms from the American public, one freedom at a time, one section of the Bill of Rights one law, each new law is ramping up the police state to create the buffer zone around the wealthy people who expect to be found out and attacked by the oppressed people who eventually, at some point, we would assume, would wake up and realize that they are being suicided or genocided in a kind of a slow motion global coup. And they want to be ready with their elite forces, their police state, their military that will be a worldwide peacekeeping force, much like on the lines of the UN, although the UN itself may be kind of a dinosaur and on its way out by now, more symbolic than anything. They are gradually working toward consolidating the gains that they've made. And this plan stretches back really 100 years or more to the 19th century and people like Darwin, who came up with or wrote the book literally about the theory of evolution. And this made people think that, look, you know, if God is not in control, then we can do whatever we want. This evolution is really what is making everything happen. And we're at the top of the heap. Maybe we're at the top of the heap because of evolution, because evolution has placed us here. Unfortunately, a lot of these people are sociopaths, and so they would naturally think that. And they, of course, discount the reality, which is that they have used their inability to have true human emotions, you know, no shame, no guilt, no conscience, to gain their position and flaunt the laws of the land, getting away with whatever they feel they can get away with, putting themselves above the law, putting themselves in a position where they are untouchable, beyond the reach of the ordinary human being to actually pull them off their throne. When we look at the history of the monarchies of the world, we can see a pattern. Now, occasionally you have benevolent monarchs who are really good and do good things and care about their people and try to help improve the lot of the ordinary citizen. And you remember, in a monarchy, almost everyone is an ordinary citizen. You only have a very small group of the elite aristocrats, the counts, the barons, and they have all the land. They have access to weaponry, the most high-tech weaponry that was available at the time. They have access to the conscripted and volunteer mercenary armies, whatever they had, to protect them and keep them in that position of power. And they have the castle surrounded with the moat, patrolled by the knights, the military, to keep them safe. And so, in effect, they are above the law. Now we're seeing that same term being used when we're talking about corporations, when we're talking about elected officials, when we're talking about appointed officials, when we're talking about almost anyone who achieves a certain level of money and power, that they are above the law. We heard that in 2008 when the banks essentially ran into a wall in which there was no more confidence in their efficacy. They were no longer operating within anything that was at all reasonable, and they were facing bankruptcy. This is a business cycle. It goes up and down. You can run up your debt and have irrational exuberance and go right way up high. But you get up so high and you're going to come crashing down. And that's what would have happened if the business cycle that happens in a capitalist society happens. But because we don't have necessarily a capitalist society that's across the board capitalist, in which you can get very wealthy, but you can lose it really fast. You can also come crashing down all the way down to the bottom. That was not allowed to happen in 2008. We had TARP. We had a congressional bailout of essentially criminal banks and the CEOs of these institutions that were, for the most part, sociopaths running up themselves into a catastrophic situation. But because the government entity itself was involved in the banks, in the corporations, in the lending institutions, in the hedge funds, in the fancy instruments that were used to run up the debt and commit fraud, perjury, deception against the American people. They were involved. They refused to allow these banks and these lending institutions to fail. And it was, of course, about housing. It was the housing. It was a bubble. Bubble is nothing new. These have happened before, and everybody lost in the housing bubble, and really it was worldwide. There was a tremendous loss of wealth for many people. People who believed they were secure in their homes with a solid mortgage suddenly found themselves underwater, that their house was not nearly worth as much as they paid for it. So they owed more on the house than it was actually worth. The only ones who were protected were those elite few running the show, the ones who caused the crisis, caused the bubble, pumped up the bubble, and they were protected. It was welfare for them, but for everyone else, they were out of luck. It wasn't welfare for them. It wasn't socialism for them. It was capitalism. And in capitalism, if you make an egregious mistake, if you get yourself out on a limb financially, there's no one there to help you, and you saw off the limb you're sitting on, or someone else saws it off because of some neglect that you did, and you didn't do your homework, then you have to pay the consequences. It's personal responsibility in a capitalist society. So you have winners and losers. In the ideal, non-existent socialist or communist society, there are no losers. Everybody is a winner. But of course, that never happens. In practice, you nevertheless still have winners and losers. There were people during the days of the Soviet Union who really liked the Soviet system. And why? Because they had employment. It was guaranteed by the state. It was a communist state, and everyone had a job. They all had money coming in. They all had a place to live. Now, it wasn't maybe a very nice place to live, but it was at least a place to live. They had food. It wasn't maybe the best food. They had clothes. Maybe it wasn't the best clothes. They had cars, most of them, many of them. They weren't maybe the best cars, but they had cars. They were cheap. They were supplied by the state. It was a planned economy. It was the result of the policy of the system which guaranteed the basic means of survival to the population. But because certain people ran the show, they very quickly after the institution of communism in Russia, the Soviet Union found that they had the power to make everyone was equal, but some people were more equal than other people. In other words, they had access to the goodies, they had access to the better apartment, the better clothes, the better cars, maybe the foreign cars that were better made, like the Mercedes, the German car. And they had access to the perks that went along with the office. And this goes and flies in the face of the equalizing, the idea of everyone equal in a communist society. A worker's paradise was how it was advertised. But it really didn't work out that way. Now, maybe if the leadership of the Soviet Union had remained egalitarian and enlightened, they might have been able to pull it off. But just as so often happens, the experiment, after many years, decades, failed. There was a lot of suffering involved in the Soviet Union. And as people began to grouse about the quality of their lifestyle, in order to stay in existence, the Soviet Union had to institute the KGB, the secret police, the knock on the door late at night, the rush into the apartment, the arrest of the dissident and take him off to interrogation, jail, long sentences, prison sentences. They used the Gulag. Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote the Gulag Archipelago, the really gripping and frightening book that was his own personal story of what happened to him after he was arrested for making a joke, really, criticizing the establishment in a letter during World War II. He was actually a soldier. He was an artillery officer in World War II on the Russian, he was a Russian soldier, and he, in a letter, of course, apparently he was young, he was naive, he didn't realize the consequences of saying something against Stalin. Now, Stalin being the leader of Russia during World War II and into the 50s, well into the 50s. So he spent 11 years in the Gulag as a result of that. And what we're seeing in the United States is beginning to look like that kind of system, in which those who question the establishment are at risk of punishment. And it hasn't got to that point, thank God, but we always have to guard against that. It may come that, and realize that there's always a possibility that down the road that may be the model, the Soviet model may be used for the American homeland. How did the Soviet Union accomplish this amazingly thorough police state situation? You've had other ones like the GDR in East Germany, very amazing level of surveillance on ordinary citizens. Nowadays, the government has the technology to surveil that people that the government of the GDR and the Soviet Union could only dream about. It's so much easier to surveil people. And people are actually getting used to the idea that they're going to be surveilled and that everything they say and do is recorded and stored in giant computers, in whole warehouses of computers, temperature controlled. And there's a number of these, and they're going to keep building more. They're storing everything. They're not just taking foreign phone calls or emails or Facebook, all this stuff. And all this information is accessible to government, military, police, those people who are interested in looking for data and data mining that they could use to discover the political proclivities of any particular individual, American citizen or not. And how will they use that? Well, we don't know. How we have to. We can only assume that, like all other tyrannies and police states before that, they will use this information to protect themselves, to enhance their power. But also there's another aspect to this, and that would be for financial gain. Because let's say an employee of a major corporation has some information about an innovation that is going to be happening, and he tweets that or talks about it on Facebook or emails someone about it, expecting that this is going to be a private communication, but it will be earth-shaking for the company, that this is going to be a tremendous boon to the value of that company. So anyone who has access to that information has instantly found a secret that could help them if they were to dabble in the stock market, and they could, in other words, buy up some of that stock before the innovation became public knowledge. They would have insider information, which is actually illegal. But then with the new world order that's developing in the 21st century, all this stuff is legal. They're finding so many ways to circumvent it. This is one of the reasons why we have in the Bill of Rights the amendment that says that the citizens' personal effects and papers are not allowed to be rifled through, and they have a level of privacy that will curtail someone from the government who wants to get this information, or anyone who wants to get this information. Because this goes back to the early days when the British were searching people's homes without a warrant, looking for incriminating evidence that they were, let's say, supporting anti-government activities such as the revolution. Well, nowadays it's the same thing, but they say that, well, what about 9/11? What about the terrorists? What about ISIS? What about domestic terrorism? We have to stop that. You want to be safe, don't you? You want to be secure, don't you? Well, if you don't let us have unlimited access to all your information, everybody's information, everything they write, everything they say, then the terrorists could hit us. They could hit us. There could be another 9/11. In the meanwhile, these small little explosions are happening every couple of weeks. And what are we looking at? What are we seeing here? We're seeing that the war on terror is coming home. It's not in Afghanistan anymore. It's not in Iraq anymore. It's on American soil. And they're saying, well, it may look like just a crazy kid on a shooting spree, but actually, he's part of a group. He's not the only one. There are a lot more of them out there. They hate America, and they hate you, they hate your freedoms, and they want to kill you. And only we can protect you from the evil domestic terrorists. And, you know, what do you think about that? And how do I know that this is going to increase in the future? Because they've been planning on this to happen for years. This, very soon after 9/11, 9/11, the Patriot Act came, then the National Defense Authorization Act, and lots of other laws strengthening, and you also had these executive orders, you had various other bills that deal with domestic terrorism. And they were expecting this, and they're getting everything in place. And why would they be expecting it? What would be the American people's motivation to become domestic terrorists? Is it because they're starving? Well, Americans are not starving. Is it because they're poor? Americans are not overall particularly poor. When you compare it to somebody like living in the Middle East or Africa or Asia and many other places, and where is it because of a war, destabilized situation where there's war everywhere, people with guns on the streets, killing people indiscriminately like the Americans did in Iraq, driving down the street, shooting people as they passed in their Hummer or their MRAP with machine guns just because it was fun, it was sport. You can watch this on YouTube. Driving down the street, shooting indiscriminately at other cars, for instance, and laughing about it and playing hillbilly music while they're doing it. Is that the reason why we have domestic terrorism? We're not seeing that happening. So why would this be happening? Well, they drag out this thing about the white supremacists from way back in the 60s, the 1960s, that they hate black people and they want to kill them. Well, despite what we saw happen in South Charleston with the church shooting, and I don't know what happened with that. I mean, we know they have the ability to essentially create assassins. They use a combination of drugs and hypnotism with the right person. They're getting very good at it. They started back in the 60s, or maybe even earlier, with MK Ultra. And MK Ultra supposedly was discontinued, but it's ongoing. They have a lot of other very sophisticated methods to bring about whatever result that they're looking for. And the result oftentimes will be to enhance their position of power, to make the American people more dependent on them. Now, if you look through history, the history is replete in the United States and other countries with false flags. Now, is the South Charleston killing of 9 people a false flag? I don't know. I do think that Sandy Hook was the epitome of false flag. The evidence is so powerful that this was a staged event that it's, in my opinion and the opinion of many others, it is beyond doubt. It is just too obvious that somebody like Adam Lanza never existed, that those children were never killed, and that it was all staged, a literally staged show that was put on with actors. And this isn't the only paid actors. Boston bombing the same way. Now, some of these things may be real. We do know that one of the side effects of the drugs that the young people are more and more taking is a psychotic break, which can lead to suicidal thoughts or actions or homicide. and there is some evidence to show that the Columbine killings, that they were real. We have the videotape. We know that those boys did walk through the school shooting people. It's on tape. Now, we haven't seen any videotapes of those people being shot in that church in Charleston. We haven't seen any videotapes of the people being shot in Sandy Hook either, the kids and the teachers. We haven't seen any of that. Just like we haven't seen much of what went on 9/11 with the so-called airplane that hit the Pentagon. To this very day, only 5 frames of video have been released. Not 5 videos, not 5 minutes, but 5 frames. 5 stills from a surveillance camera that was pointed at the Pentagon and should have shown an airplane hitting the Pentagon. But it doesn't show an airplane hitting the Pentagon. We know an airplane went over the Pentagon, toward the Pentagon, was in the vicinity of the Pentagon, but we haven't actually seen credible evidence that an airplane actually hit the Pentagon at all. And why would they lie about that? Because they had a story to tell, a narrative to tell, and they're going to stick to their story no matter what. It doesn't matter what the facts are. What matters is the myth that was created about 19 hijackers, 4 airplanes, heroic passengers, dastardly villains driving airplanes into the Twin Towers and causing them to collapse, both of them. And so they don't care whether thousands of people around the world have refuted many of these myths with very powerful evidence. They're going to stick with them. Why? If they were to change one aspect of the 9/11 story, then that would weaken their myth that they've created. So it must stay the same. And when you're talking about a truthful situation, where you're looking for new information about an enormously complex event like 9/11, new information is bound to come out over time. People do research. They find, oh, well, wait a minute, they're wrong about this. This is what actually happened. But no, none of that must ever change. And within a matter of months, the story was completely done. It was finished. Within a matter of minutes, actually, after the event happened, it was blamed on Osama bin Laden, who was supposedly living in a cave and directing the whole operation. And then we had people like Donald Rumsfeld come out and show on TV, network TV, a map of the caves the cave system, very complex with several layers and all these different rooms. And he had this map, not a map, it was like a schematic. It wasn't even a schematic, it was a cutaway. It was a drawing, a cutaway of inside the cave. Here's what they have, folks. They are in there, and we have to find them. Well, that turned out to be completely wrong and just completely made up. No such complex was ever found in the mountains of Afghanistan. And believe me, the U.S. Army really did look for it, because obviously that would be the headquarters of Al-Qaeda. Except it never existed. It wasn't Osama bin Laden that did it. It was the people at the very top of this world. Those people who are, using their belief in evolution and their destiny as a super race in the future, using their seed vault to get the planet ready for the future, and to do whatever it takes to get their power in place so that it is unshakable, using technology, the military, and all the other tools, the media, the food, everything, completely all their ducks in a row, so when they are ready, they can pull the trigger, drop the hammer on the human race, and cause the enormous collapse that would entail probably mass starvation. So that's all there is for today, and we'll see you again next week, and have a great weekend and sleep well.